So I'd like to just introduce Marge Mayo to you. Most of you will know her, I'm sure, if not in person, in writing. And she's a very much loved and probably our longest standing ever member of the CDJ board. None of us can remember when she joined the board, and we're all sad, but felt that we really ought to let her go after probably 30 years.
75.
75 was it?
75 years.
Not yet. Really. And for many of us, it continues to be a great inspiration. She's Emeritus Professor of Community Development at Goldsmiths in London, and she's here to share some thoughts on looking backwards and looking forwards on community development, which is a perfect time for her reflections on the past, present and future of community development.
Okay.
So thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed, Jo, and thanks everybody. This feels a bit like reminiscence therapy, except I can't remember the date when I joined the CDJ board, which wasn't very good. Anyway, I was going to start by reflecting on some of the ways in which CDJ has been developing over the years. But actually, I think I can go very lightly over this because we had excellent contributions last night. And so I will go lightly on that. And likely on the CDJ's long-standing commitment to facilitating learning transnationally. Or what I am going to be suggesting is that this has absolutely additional urgency in the context of neoliberal globalization. Communities are being fragmented and displaced, and that's both within and across national boundaries. But communities are also developing new ways of communicating and novel ways of organising, building alliances across sectors transglobally. So I think, as Mick Carpenter was suggesting last night, there are a lot of issues here in terms of the kind of community development contributions that can be made to social transformation agendas. And as he also said, I think the concept of social class is key here, and intersectionalities, the ways in which the concept of social class and the way we understand it relates to divisions of caste and faith, as well as those that we're perhaps more used to discussing, race, ethnicity, and gender. I think those raise very important questions about the kind of scope that there is for alliances and the kind of scope for the way forward. Particularly taking account, I think, of the implications in the current context for the way in which I think the concept of community itself has actually been shifting, and the way in which transnational communities are emerging, and how we can actually take account of that in the context of this dispossessions, stigmatization, and massive dispersals of communities that have been accompanying neoliberal globalization and the so-called war on terror. So in summary, these are some of the themes that I've been reflecting on as I've gone back over these histories. Relationships across what we used to call the North-South divide, but as my Australian colleagues very correctly point out, that's not a very accurate way of thinking about divisions in the modern world. Relationships between community development and the state, when the whole notion of the state has become much more complex. Of course, divisions within as well as between communities, and taking account of the dark side of community, and of course the notion of community development, community and community development itself. I think each of these has implications for everybody who's involved in community development work, whether as frontline workers, managers, teachers, trainers or researchers. As just quote my colleague Gary Craig here, he's so clearly pointed out, community workers are often called on by government to contribute to the peaceful management of change, to help people adjust to the insecurity and fragmentation of their lives, which raises the question again that Mick posed last night, to what extent have they been and do they continue to be part of the problem and or part of the solution, which is, I think, some of the implications that perhaps we'll come back to at the end. Finding ways to support communities, taking up immediate issues and having longer term strategies. And I think when I started out, these two tended to get posed as alternatives, either you were doing one or the other, rather than how you actually link the two. Facilitating alliances, understanding and respecting differences as well as common interests, and all of this in, of course, the context of shrinking resources and increasing marketisation, which very much affects our sector as well as everybody else. Not to forget the war on terror. This is an American cartoon, but I think somehow this actually says it all. Okay, so a little bit of reminiscence therapy. As Keith was saying last night, when I joined the board, the issues were very much around how do we move on from the colonial era. And I was just reading something that Rajesh Tandon, and people have come across Rajesh's work from Priya, doing powerful, empowering participatory work in Asia and in many other places. And he was reading a quote about community participation. Action groups and voluntary organisations in India were part of a Western imperialist strategy, with foreign funding undermining the leadership of the party and misguiding the revolution. And I did put the revolution in italics. Leaving him to really puzzle, what does this mean if the kind of work he's been trying to do has actually been seen in this way? How can you move beyond attempts to create, I'm quoting here, plausibly democratic institutions without serious dislocation of the vested interests of the status quo? Not to forget, at that period, the Cold War and keeping the colonies safe from communism. I think the introduction to this, has everybody seen this book? I have this is a conflict of interest, but I think it's a great read. That argues very clearly community development summarises the case. Community development has been promoted to service imperial agendas, managing social change in the interests of the powerful, facilitating self-help in order to legitimise reductions in service provision, shifting responsibilities from the public sector to the voluntary, NGO and community sectors. But, so, conversely, as community development being promoted for alternative agendas to facilitate solidarity, critical understanding, building progressive movements for social development, and indeed for social justice. So I think, in a way, that summarises the whole arguments about how to develop the kind of critical analysis of the contradictory, seemingly contradictory possibilities, a force for participation and empowerment, however defined, or a tool for the management of the poorest and the most excluded and oppressed. Including, I think there's one particular angle that I was made aware of recently, which was about the use of intelligence. And this takes me back to being a VSO worker and hearing the Peace Corps workers talk about who'd been round from their supervisors to find out who was what and who was doing what and who was involved in what kind of activity, straight intelligence gathering. And I just think, I was remembering that when I was thinking about the tragic murders in Afghanistan recently, the murder of NGO workers, and thinking about how dangerous it is when states use NGO workers or the NGO sector, not those particular ones of course, but in general, when they use community development for those kind of intelligence gathering purposes, how incredibly dangerous that makes the world for NGO workers who are trying to do a really vital and important job in what may well be very dangerous circumstances. Anyway, I'll just give you one little further piece of reminiscence about the colonial period, because some of the things that Mick and others were saying last night really resonated for me. I did VSO in what was then northern Nigeria in the mid-1960s. And I think that did have a lasting impression on me in a number of ways. One is it raised questions for me about how far I understood racism, and the answer was very little. Both the crude racism of the expatriates, which was something I'd never experienced before, but also more subtle forms of racism within and between groups, and the absolute toxic legacy of Lord Lugard's strategy to divide and rule, and how that actually had fanned tensions and rivalries, quite murderous rivalries as it turned out, when I was there, thinking I need to completely rethink racism and how it intersects with class and other divisions. But the other thing I was going to say is that despite all this, I really learned how people in what you would think would be the most difficult circumstances, and one of my jobs as a community development worker was to work with women who were actually in Purda, what they could do. And when I looked at what I was supposed to be doing, I could not believe it. It had been designed by somebody from the Women's Institute, and the first job, well, we had to teach them how to knit babies' booties, and how to make folders for their needlework. I thought, that is really, apart from the fact that I didn't know how to do it myself. Of course, what I didn't know at the time was that embroidery was actually a very marketable skill, but it was a skill that the men and boys did in that part of the world, so women weren't going to get a look in. But what they did do is together we worked out with old newspaper how to make patterns to make children's clothes, and that was a fantastically marketable skill, which actually enabled them to get some cash resources of their own, which was hugely important. And so they were a very small lesson in the extraordinary resilience of people with a very little bit of support in enabling them to make what for them were really quite important changes in their livelihoods. Okay, so that's my first experience of the colonial past, which I came back and found CDJ was grappling with these issues and how to move on. I was going to say something about the history of CDJ in the intervening years. There were good years and there were lean years, but I think a lot was said last night, so I can skip fairly massively over that. But there are just a few points about it that I would like to draw attention to. First of all, I think, I'd like to say something about the way in which the changing relationships between community development in what were then termed the countries of the South and the countries of the North developed. It wasn't just that we were trying to bring home lessons and reflect, which we were, in different ways, of course, and drawing different conclusions. But I think the 70s and 80s were decades which were marked with very important shifts in the way theoretical approaches to community education and development were thought about. And those had very strong roots in the global South. I think Paulo Freire's writings were mentioned yesterday, work that he developed in Latin America and then, of course, elsewhere. I'm not sure if we mentioned the whole development of participatory action research and the work of people like Fals Borda from Colombia and other places, which was then taken up and developed by Rajesh Tandon and others in India and many other places. I think these were huge influences. I just picked up one other, but I'm going to skip very lightly on this slide, because if you look at it, you'll see you'll guess where it's come from, which is shameful. You guess where it's come from? Yeah, I'm afraid so. But training for transformations was, I think, another very, very influential way of thinking about community development and community education, and that came straight from work in Southern Africa. So that's, I think, an influence that we really need to value. The next aspect that I was going to mention is the changing relationships between community development and structures of governance, locally, nationally, and internationally, and the challenges that raises for building alliances. I think there was some reference yesterday to the new public management and the whole notion of governance rather than government, a much more slippery kind of approach, which I think poses a whole lot of questions for what it means to be in and against the state, but what about also for the state in the sense of wanting to preserve public responsibilities and public provision. And I think that, coupled with, at this period, increasing awareness of the development of international institutions of governance and international standards for development and the ways in which these can impact very locally. And I want to come back to that because I think it's really important. I think one of the issues that was discussed yesterday was the changing way in which divisions and inequalities within as well as between communities were being explored in this period. And there was reference to the work of the Community Development Project. This does actually feel like reminiscence because I was involved in that, in the inter-project, in the research team, though not I'm sorry to say, in the production of two absolutely seminal publications, which you probably know, Gilding the Ghetto and The Costs of Industrial Change, which I think were absolutely seminal. And momentous in terms of the implications for wider strategies for building links between communities and the labour and progressive movements. I think there was some reference to the criticism that CDP workers did see it as either or. Somebody, I think Angus pointed me to a quote, somebody has said, we talked revolution and we organised the bingo. But actually, I think that may be so, but I think a lot of links were made, and they were very important links. I was actually talking to Mick last night about research he's doing about what's the legacy of the CDPs. Now, the CDPs left that very, very challenging, critical legacy. But they also left some very practical legacies, and we were talking about, for example, how I'd come across the Law Centre in Coventry, which came out of the work of the Coventry CDP, and how I'd been quoting this as a model of how a law centre, even in very difficult times, can actually provide an immediate service for people and take up advocacy and campaigning. And there you are, it's still there, and its roots go way back. So I think that was too crude. And I think the view that the CDP had a monolithic view of the state is also much too crude. And if you look at the end of Gilding the Ghetto, it talks about our experience made us acutely conscious of the range of opinions within state structures. And they go on to give examples of the differences, and therefore the ways in which it was possible to work with different sections in the pursuit of progressive change. To resist the cuts collectively, they concluded, and change the structures through which these services are provided so that both workers and consumers, communities, have a service which is geared towards their needs and over which they have control. And I think that's very, very contemporary kind of comment about public services. I think the point that perhaps does bear further consideration is the point about how far at that point we, all of us, had explored the interconnections with gender and other forms of oppression, issues which have been taken forward and very strongly by social movements like disability movement, which have really put these issues on the agenda in very strong ways. And the other one that came on the agenda, I think, at this time was issues about the environment and wider understandings of health and well-being. There's an article in this book which looks at that, the environmental crisis and community development and green agendas. And of course, CDJ's own special issue on common sense, new thinking about an old idea, absolutely poses afresh those issues about the environment, about health and well-being in much broader ways. Okay, so I think enough for the past. What about the present, the current context? I think the significance of neoliberal globalisation has been highlighted very strongly. If you're going to use the new management speak, you'd say it provides new opportunities as well as challenges, which it certainly does, offering new possibilities for a sense of solidarity and new opportunities for community engagement with expanding spaces for public action transnationally as well as more locally. John Gaventa and Rajesh Chandran wrote that, and I think it's absolutely true. But of course, the converse, the other side, is that far from extending democratisation, whether or not that's the rationale for different interventions and the promotion of human rights, deepening neoliberal globalisation policies have actually been undermining both the role of the state and the independent role of the third sector. And there has been collusion with neoliberal agendas, especially from some of the larger organisations involved. They put pressures on the voluntary community sector to provide public services on the cheap, potentially squeezing out smaller community-based organisations, as well as opening up potential markets and spearheading opportunities for privatisation. And I'm sorry, but I'm sure we can all think of examples where that has actually been happening. And whilst undermining paying conditions of frontline service providers in the process. Newer versions of older dilemmas, but on more extensive scales. Though I would say at this point, as my fellow authors for the book that we're going to launch on Friday kept reminding me, do not think, well, they said it more politely, that what you've been experienced is what and how this is being experienced in other contexts, including rural contexts, because these processes take very different forms, and it is absolutely essential to understand that before you can make any kind of effective intervention. So I was going to say something about fragmentation and social cleansing, and the ways in which communities form and reform in response to local, national and international pressures. I'm going to give some examples from the book that Mayshore and I are working on, but also some examples from the work that I've been doing with communities and trade unions in London, which might sound very parochial, but I'll try and justify that. I think despite politicians' rhetoric about the importance of promoting decentralisation and increasing community involvement, our previous government here has talked about the big society even. The reality in Britain has been very, very different. From where I see it, communities are being torn apart, divide and rule again, but in different ways. Whether communities are defined in terms of locality or in terms of identity and shared interests, powerful processes are at work here, as rampant marketisation has been wreaking havoc, reinforced by public policies to restructure, either further undermine the last remaining vestiges of the welfare state. So changes in the benefit system have actually been compounding these processes of fragmentation and dislocation. And I'd argue that these processes are being experienced particularly acutely in London, which is Britain's capital city, but of course it's also a city of capital, a world capital city, as geographers like Doreen Massey and Saskia Sassen have pointed out. So in a way you can see some of these processes in very sharp form. Of course London has been a destination for newcomers since, well, probably well before the Romans came actually, whether they're migrants from elsewhere in Britain or migrants from further afield, including of course countries previously colonised by Britain, coming, whether it's in search of safety or pursuit of more sustainable livelihoods or both. When they came, they tended to form their own communities alongside more established communities, living more or less harmoniously and experiencing more or less racism and exclusion over time. With neoliberal globalisation, however, these processes have taken on renewed political significance. Concerns have been highlighted in current debates about Britain's continuing membership of the European Union, and about the free movement of labour alongside the free movement of capital within Fortress Europe. And negative attitudes towards migrants have been fanned more generally. The aftermath of 9/11, the aftermath of 7th of July, the anniversary of which is just coming up on Monday, which is an opportunity to restir some of that in different ways, both as a horror story and as a story of the way in which different communities actually came together in response to that. And of course the war on terror and the disastrous effects of United States and British foreign policy interventions. I think the last figure I heard was 60 million people currently displaced as an effect of war on violence. It may be much higher. That's just a figure I picked up recently. And of course those who are, or indeed who look as though they might be Muslim, are particularly vulnerable to discrimination and exclusion, which of course puts significant challenges for community development workers and how you can work to promote solidarity and social justice in that kind of context. I think whilst all that's been going on, there have been parallel concerns. Migrants are being blamed in Britain for scrounging on welfare, despite the fact that they're actually less rather than more likely to be drawing on public resources. And I think that they're blamed for taking local jobs, the fact that public services actually depend on them, as do a range of employers, including the most exploitative employers, who are now saying we can't pick the harvest if we don't have the migrant workers to do the job. And I think particularly in London, the issue that is real dynamite within and between communities is the issue about the housing crisis and how migrants are being blamed for taking housing and therefore excluding local people. They're wrongly believed to be jumping the queue for social housing. And they're also, incidentally, blamed, that there's less said about that, for driving up house prices, because of course certain oligarchs and mafioso are buying up property, keeping it empty deliberately because all they need to realise is the capital gain. They never intend anybody to live in the property. There's less discussion of that there is a bit more discussion of that now. I think they're very toxic myths because they're very understandable. Because there is a crisis about affordable housing in the city. The precariousness of employment is a crisis, particularly a crisis for young people. And the pressures on public services, trying to get your children into school, and concerns about welfare. You know, they're real crises, and people are understandably very concerned. Just to take the housing crisis, because something that I've been involved with recently. It's not just the poor. Low and middle income people are finding it impossible. I think owner occupation is just not an option. I gather that the average income in London is just on £30,000 a year. The average income that you need to buy any kind of home is over double that, at 77,000. So it's completely ruled out for a whole generation. Meanwhile, the stock of social housing has been depleted, and over a third of the properties that were bought as a result of right to buy policies are not occupied by owners at all. They're rented out at much higher rents and probably worse repairs. So the situation is going from bad to worse, and redevelopment schemes are compounding the issue. I think because what happens is that when there's a redevelopment, the prices go up. This reminds me of the kind of arguments that there were about redevelopment in the cities in the United States in the 60s and 70s, you know, about redevelopment actually means black people's removal from the city. I think last year 8,000 relatively affordable homes were lost in the city through redevelopment schemes. So I say they've been absolutely compounding the effect, which is, it is effectively, people are talking about social cleansing. And that's what's happening, social cleansing. But it's not just the very poorest. And I'll come back to this because I think that's why an understanding of social class is very important, to see that people in that situation, public sector workers, have got very similar problems. And to those who are actually at immediate risk of becoming homeless. I think last year there was an 80% increase in homeless families who were actually rehoused out of the city. You know, so they're losing their networks, whatever. their support systems, struggling to refine how to get their kids into school, how to find a doctor and all the rest of it. Of course, that figure doesn't tell you anything about the people who didn't come to public authorities' attention because they managed to rehouse them themselves, whether that was what they wanted or not. And the whole question of choice comes in here. What does it actually mean to have choice when you can't afford to do any other? Okay, so in summary, I'd say processes of displacement and dispossession are taking place amongst established communities that are being fragmented. Just as these processes have been experienced by the migrants, including the refugees and asylum seekers, who've too often been targeted and blamed, and have themselves been the subject of double displacement. I'll just tell you one story here, but it's one amongst many, many, many. Last week I met with a Somali woman. She came to Britain in search of safety for herself and her children. Since she came here, she's been forced to move 8 times. And each time she's had to cope with sorting out for her kids. She was taking 3 buses to get her kids to school, then back again, and then back to pick them up. She was in a queue for a course to learn English so that she could improve her situation and maybe get a job. Just as she came up to the top of the queue to get the course, she was forced to move yet again. So she started another queue, and the same thing happened again. Now, sadly, this story is not an unusual story. This is happening all over. So I don't know what to say really about this. It actually makes me so angry. But having said that, what can we do to rebuild mutuality and solidarity within and between communities? And what's the role of community development here? I was just thinking of a phrase that was used last night about only connect, and I think that's a very important one to hang on to. Despite the forces of fragmentation, which have been exacerbating tensions and divisions within and between communities, there have actually been extraordinary examples of resistance. Housing estates where households have been rehoused with relatively restricted links so far between them have become the sites of solidarity and resistance. One example here was a place called E15. I don't know if people in Britain have read about it in the papers. And as I understand it, the people on that estate mostly had been rehoused there, so they didn't know each other. There wasn't a strong sense of community. But when they were faced with this threat, they actually found ways of coming together and actually mounting a very powerful campaign in face of this common threat. And there have been a number of examples of high-profile campaigns building solidarity in the process, some of which have community workers, some of which have other people, including high-profile media people, which whatever you or I might think about that, when it comes to marching on Downing Street and you've got one of these characters with the mic, it does actually get media attention and it does make an impact anyway. The picture here is from one of these, and people are making the links with austerity. But I think you probably can't see it very well. The woman in front is actually looking seriously puzzled and upset. And you're thinking, actually, that's probably what it feels like. Okay, there's solidarity, but you're probably feeling very, very disturbed and upset and anxious because you do not know what your future is going to be for yourself or your family or, Okay. So I think that's communities of locality which form are fragmented and can actually reform. I think communities of identity have been similarly formed and reformed. And I'll just give an example here from a community project that I've worked with over the years because they've provided fantastic placements for our students, and some of our students have gone on to work there, which is always something. It's a delight to see your former students doing sterling jobs in projects that some of the people who teach are kind of nodding here. It is one of the great rewards of the job. This organisation is called Praxis. It's a London-based organisation that works with migrants, refugees and asylum seekers. It provides individual advice and support. It's a welcoming place for people who've been displaced. But it's also worked around advocacy and campaigning. I think when they started, they tended to work with groups who'd come from one place, who were already a community in some sense. So they worked with exiles from Chile, exiles from Southern Africa, from Namibia. Fortunately, happily, through the struggle, some of those were able to go home safely. What has then happened is that the whole process has become more complex. So they do work with groups who come from the same place, but they also work with people across that. So for example, they have a group of support for women who've been trafficked from different places, and they have a group of young refugees who come from all sorts of different contexts, who are actually, well, they're almost self-supporting, not entirely self-supporting, providing peer-to-peer support. And actually some of the things they do are using the arts and writing songs and poetry together. So there you've got communities of identity, but there are other different kinds of community of identities from the more geographically based ones. I think these girls are probably from one of the Latin American groups, but they're taking part in a festival because they're very good at festivals and celebrating. I think Praxis is a very good example of community development support and peer-to-peer support. But Praxis are coping with the pressures of the current contracting arrangements. They were telling me how the contracts to get resources are coming in bigger and bigger batches. So they will be going up against Serco, G4S. I don't know if other people beyond Britain have come across these outfits, huge private contracting organisations, some of whom use smaller based organisations as bid candy, but they then go on to pass on the risks to them. And while all that's going on with resources, the actual pressures and the demands, the needs are growing exponentially, particularly with threats both to changes in welfare and of course threats of the Human Rights Act in Britain, which will pose just one more challenge. I'd like to just say something very quickly about building alliances and then something about the concept of community, but I'll be very brief. I think we've got some fantastic chapters in this book which actually talk about building alliances across divides that perhaps found it more difficult to work together in the past. I'll give you, there are some fantastic examples of environmental groups that refuse to see environment and safety and well-being as being in opposition to jobs and actually managing to link concerns for jobs with concerns for environmental safety. There are also, we've got examples of trade union and community group collaboration. This is around the living wage campaign, which is something that's been waged in London, in other places. I don't know if people have come across this. I think all I want to say about this is that though it's quoted as an example, a fantastic example where trade unions and communities have actually been achieving immediate concrete results for their communities, is that it's been hugely problematic. As anybody who's been involved in this kind of work knows, one amongst the many tensions that have had to be worked with is the whole notion of what is democracy and how do you organise, horizontally or vertically? Are people familiar with that horizontal versus vertical organisation? A lot of heads are nodding, and it is very difficult. And unless there are community workers and trade union workers who understand that, you just get locked in accusations and counter-accusations about how you organise and what's the legitimacy for what you're doing. I think the other point about alliances, and I'd say that the book raises, is about alliances with the state and institutions of governance. And there are examples where it's quite clear that different political parties in power have very significant implications for how far community organisations and community development workers can actually engage or not engage, and that it does make a difference. And I think there's very solid evidence to demonstrate what seems to me to be a fairly obvious fact. What we also have is examples of where social movements in which communities were massively involved have actually taken state power. One example is South Africa, another example is Bolivia. And in both cases, they pose an awful lot of questions about effectively back to being in and against the state and keeping your independence while being supportive of what's going on, but not getting sucked into becoming apologists, particularly if decisions are being taken that you are actually not in the interests of the communities you represent. And just one final one about alliances, because this is the Global Campaign for Education, because I've talked about this lots of times before. Again, it is a campaign that is international and involves children in different countries, but it also involves international pressure on the international finance system and on governments. And it brings in teachers and parents and children. And of course there are lots of tensions, there are bound to be tensions, but it is an example of where it has been possible to have these moments when the local and the national and the international can actually be linked in constructive ways. I think the final point to make about this, though, is first of all that a critical understanding of the concept of social class is absolutely crucial here, so that you actually understand who do you share common interests with around what, and who do you not, and what are the possibilities for short-term alliances or short-term community campaigns and groups, because not every group is going to live for very long, and that can be fine if its purpose is met. And then, but what are the possibilities for building longer-term movements and coalitions in the pursuit of social justice agendas? So we argued that. The final point, all right, another minute, is the concept of community itself. And I think the last time somebody asked me to include a discussion of the concept of community in something I was writing, I more or less flatly refused and said, I can't bear to do this again, please. But actually, the more I think about it, it has been changing, and it is changing. It's become much more fluid, I think, in some ways, whether it's communities of locality or identity and interest. It's become much more fluid, and we need to understand that critically. We need to understand, there are also communities of choice. I'm involved in a co-housing project, which is about a group of people coming together to form a community of self-help, older people who want to live in the same space and provide mutual support. So that's something different again. But the one that I think is most challenging is the whole notion of transnational communities. Those who form and reform links when they migrate, but also maintain or rediscover links with their communities of origin. I think one example of this is, I think somebody mentioned yesterday, transnational remittances, which are just one illustration of the importance of those kind of ties for many communities. I think the other side of that, though, is that the so-called prevent agendas. Do people know what prevent agendas are? People in Britain, well, it's government programs to identify possible terrorists and save them from being infected with terrorism. And those kind of programs, I think, are typically having absolutely the reverse effect. I'm thinking of an example of a group of young Somali men that I knew of and through, who youth worker organised a visit to Somaliland, which was fantastic for those young people. They came back full of determination to raise money for their counterparts to play football and to do other things. It was a real example of transnational solidarity. They immediately start being questioned. What are they doing? Why have they been? They must have been going there to further terrorist aims. And of course, that kind of surveillance immediately have the opposite effect. It makes them understandably extremely angry and suspicious of the state and of these kind of programs, and actually suspicious of their own community and youth workers if they're thought to be actually promoting these kind of prevent agendas. It puts them in a very, very difficult position. So I think that's, the alienation of those who we want to be working with and alongside is a huge issue. I think that's probably enough. I've taken my time anyway, about the potential, but also some of the challenges in building alliances, recognising that some will be short-term, but actually my personal particular interest is in the possibilities of also welding coalitions of longer-term movements that do share a concern with social justice and equalities and sustainable development. So on that note, I'm just going to leave you with a few of the questions that this throws up for me, which takes us back to the beginning about finding ways of linking immediate issues to wider issues, building alliances in the short term and the longer term, really understanding and taking account of differences, and then rethinking what all this means for how the changes in our world are impacting on communities and on the future scope and urgent needs for community development. Thanks.
Thank you so much to Marge for that. And Marge would like you to think a bit about these questions and then maybe discuss them in pairs, and then start to raise your questions or ask Marge for more information. If you have a question for Marge or a comment for Marge, now's the moment. Okay.
Right, I think it's probably simplest just to take them in terms of where you are in rows. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Is that okay? And then I'll try and answer them together, if that's okay.
Thank you for, as usual, a really, interesting and comprehensive overview. I guess my question relates more to absence than actually what you did say. And it's around, if we're looking forwards, indeed if we're looking backwards, it's around the role of the private sector and whether there is a chronic blind spot for community development in terms of the way it sees and relates to the private sector. And certainly, obviously this is hugely complex, hugely problematic, as problematic as, the problems that you've referred to, but certainly internationally, local and national and international agencies are trying to figure out how to engage with the private sector in a way that will contribute to social change and will contribute to, the well-being of people. So that I would have liked to have heard more about that.
I'm Janki, and my question is not necessarily to you, but to all of us as well. Community development, how cognizant are we as community workers who believe in a certain sort of an ideology? How do we look at, or how do we interface with the fact that there's a huge upsurge and rise of right-wing governments across countries, including my own? There are voices which tell us that it's actually is an utter failure of what we stand for. So have community development workers or has community organizing become marginal to issues of social justice and well-being and so on? Or is community organizing being usurped and appropriated by the right-wing forces to further fuel neoliberal policies?
Just wait till the airplane's gone.
Yeah, okay,
Yep.
thanks. Yeah.
Appropriation of community development by the right wing.
Adam Dinham, also from Goldsmiths. So, Marge, you and I have discussed some of these things before, but I wonder if you comment on them just to get them on the table. I've got three really quick points. One is the question about, you talked a bit about religion and faith, but from the point of view of risk, the war on terror. And I wonder about what the place is of the faith-based contribution in community development. And within that particularly, the extent to which we do or don't equip community development professionals for religious literacy, for the encounter with the religion and belief diversity that they are increasingly needing to handle. The second is a question about the massively changed situation for the gay community in the context of same-sex marriage and the impact on the sense of community for gay people, which is both spatial and around identity as well. And I wonder if you comment on that. And the third is about the mother/father, depending on your perspective on it, of all communities, the European community, and what's happening there with Greece at the moment.
Yeah. Sorry, we want you to come in and then I'll try and come back. Yeah.
Well, mine is not a question to Marge specifically, but to all of us and to CDJ in particular. I agree with you strongly that we need to take account of differences and diversities. And from that context, if we look at the CDJ publications, in sub-Saharan Africa particularly, the focus is on the practice-based writings. And because of the seemingly overemphasis on the academic dimension in CDJ, I want to say that's my thinking. It is important that looking forward, CDJ should also rethink its strategy in terms of creating space for this practice-based writings. Even though yesterday we understand that there is also something on that, but then creating additional space for that is very important. Secondly, to make CDJ and other learning materials about community development available to countries in sub-Saharan Africa, it is important that some of the ways by which this thing gets to Africa is simplified in the context of technology, for example. So there's a need for us to look at the technological component of how we get some of these materials. Let me give you a typical example. In Nigeria, it has been very easy for us to access CDJ through the British Council. And you know we have challenges around electricity and technology, internet service connection. So for a typical student or researcher to access CDJ and other related community development materials is very, very difficult. And even the payment system, I kept talking about this, the payment system, but how you pay to even own one is a key challenge for most people in sub-Saharan Africa. So if we are to address the need to enhance greater opportunities for learning and for practice, looking forward, these issues should be addressed.
Okay, thanks. First point about blind spot about the private sector. Absolutely, hands up. I personally find it difficult. I was reminded of this with a local community campaign at the end of my street where the tube is being closed, and it has a huge and appalling effect on small businesses like the dry cleaners, as well as on the people in the neighbourhood. And of course, we've all got to work together to take on this and to support them. And then you realise, wait a minute, I didn't think of myself as working with small businesses. But of course, we have a common interest, and we need to be able to work together. I think in terms of funding, I didn't say anything about it, maybe it's not that different in terms of how you think about it as to how you think about state funding. You think about there are different agendas here, and can you find common ground, and how far are you prepared to be drawn away to fit somebody else's agenda, and where are you prepared to negotiate the compromises. But yes, it's an issue that needs to be thought about. Adam's point about faith, he's absolutely right. We do need to equip community development workers, and we need to have it out in the open. I must say, when I was first teaching community development, we didn't talk about faith, and I rather completely wrongly assumed that most of the students weren't particularly motivated by faith either. Of course, many of them were, but we didn't talk about it. And so having an understanding, not just of what the different faiths overall are, but the differences within them, as well as the differences between them, I think is crucial. Because it's very easy to caricature particular faiths as having one position or another, and that's wildly wrong, at least from where I see it. But of course they need to understand the position that people who don't have any faith come from a range of different, being an agnostic is quite a wide spread of positions as well as being an atheist. So yes, we do need to equip professionals. And yes, I think the point about the gay community actually illustrates something very, very important about how social movements working alongside others have actually changed popular perceptions. And I think it's an example that goes along, I think, much more successfully perhaps than the disability movement has made a huge impact, but the gay community has had a huge impact. We need to understand why that is. How is it that they've been able to mobilize in this way? How is it that they've managed to have powerful spokespeople and so on that has shifted attitudes in this way? And what can we learn from that and celebrate? The point about the European community and Greece, I have absolutely no idea. And I'm sort of watching the news in absolute tenterhooks. But I do think it relates to your point about how we interface with the rise of right-wing and populist movements. And I saw a piece the other day criticising Syriza for being populist and this and that. And you think, do you know what this reminds me of? There's a little poem that Brecht wrote about the government has lost confidence in the people, and he's saying, wouldn't it be better to get a new people? And but in a sense, what we're saying is if we don't work with people where they're at and around the issues that concern them, and Syriza obviously has been able to do that, though it's a deeply divided country. And just on the question of Greece, I find that terrifying, because they've had military dictatorship and civil war within my lifetime. But the dark side of movements is that's something we have to understand. And if we're not able to work with people's real fears, then people will perhaps be attracted to those who do, but they might do it in ways that we don't like at all, like extreme right-wing movements or fundamentalist movements, divisive movements. I mean, we can see that in Britain. So I think it poses huge challenges for community development. If we're not there, other people will be. Yeah, it's a long haul, isn't it? I mean, from what you've said, this is not just a problem here or in Europe, it's a much, much wider problem. In terms of the points that you raise about CDJ, I think they're really important issues. I'm sure that the editorial board is going to be picking up on those. I think the only other point I'd say is that I'm sure there's more scope, isn't there, for people who are comfortable writing to partner up with people who are more used to being in practice, so that they can have articles that are based on dialogue. And I think this is something that has been tried in CDJ, hasn't it? And I'm sure there's more scope for this kind of thing, as well as finding other ways of making the journal accessible. But they're very, very important points. Okay, should we get some questions from this side of the room? And I think I saw 1, 2, 3, 4 hands. So maybe, again, if we take them, to make it easier for the mic, if we take them, oh, it goes. I was going to say, wouldn't it be easy if we take them from back to front, from front to back, rather?
Ona McCardle is, I doubt I need the mic, but maybe for the camera. Ona McCardle is my name. I work in Maynooth University and I teach community workers, and I sometimes feel I'm becoming a bit of an extinct breed, but we still teach community workers, and one of the things we talked about in our small group was the importance of hope and indignation, and very much stimulated and reflected within your own presentation, Marjorie. And we started by saying what gives us cause now to be hopeful, and there was a sense in the past that people were more hopeful. But I think the conclusion we came to, and certainly my own view, is that it's really crucial that people recognise and remember what gives us cause to be indignant, very much based on Paulo Freire's ideas. So what makes us indignant, and the importance of indignation as a starting point, but balancing that out with recognising and remembering what gives us cause to be hopeful. But my own view is that it's very difficult to work with communities to be indignant and recognise the reasons for which they should be indignant, and also to look towards possibilities for change if community workers ourselves aren't either indignant and also hopeful. And I think for me, it really raises questions about where are the spaces for doing community work and community development. I know in many of the conversations I've had here in the UK, there are few spaces for doing community development and working with people to be indignant and to work on that indignation for change. And I think those of us that are concerned with community work and community development do need to be trying to fight for the spaces to do it. But that's an agenda for another day and today, maybe.
Hi, Marge. Excellent presentation. Charlie McConnell from the International Association for Community Development. Over the last 50 years, community developers, community organisers have been appalling at organising themselves. We're a very ambivalent discipline, a very badly organised discipline, even at the height, whatever it was, the halcyon days in the 70s and 80s, barely 10% of practitioners in Britain ever joined the Association of Community Workers. And that's my understanding, that picture's pretty common around the world. So why, well, first of all, why as community organisers have we been so appalling at organising ourselves and therefore our conditions and our training and all that, and trying to protect that? And what guidance and advice would you give looking forward?
Thanks for your kind of really excellent talk. It's Rob Macmillan from the University of Birmingham. So on your second point about building alliances, a lot of community development discussions talk about social movements and participatory action as kind of ways forward. But what about alliances with political parties in terms of social justice, or are they just fatally compromised?
Was there another one? Yeah.
Thanks very much, Marjorie. I'd just ask you to check in on the aspect of what factors or perhaps have contributed to us losing our way in the 50 years that we're broadly reflecting on. And if I could pinpoint that to a quite significant publication that came from the CDPs, actually called The Making of the Ruling Class, which drew attention to the things that latterly that Danny Dorling has been talking about, that elitism is effective, exclusion is necessary, prejudice is natural. That publication at that time was drawing attention, if not just in that language, to some of these issues. So I think my challenge is that that's been missed out in terms of the landscape that we're looking at, and in particular, the absence of any substantial engagement of community development with community economic development. And if one looks to Mondragon and Maranelda and all of these situations where the economy has been looked at, that we've been less than clear of the kind of transformation that we would wish to happen. And in some ways, there's a link I'm trying to make between that early making of the ruling class and that relatively recent notion that it's important for people to have a living wage. And there are people actually in this room working in institutions at the present time who won't get an agreement to pay a living wage, you know, whose wage structure reflects the values which are abhorrent to the people that are here. So the question is as to whether the universities are in the pocket of the neoliberal agenda, and whether, in a sense, that's the possibility of moving forward from such a weak base.
Wow. Okay. Well, the first point about hope and indignation, I just completely agree with you. I absolutely agree with you. Charlie's point about community workers being poor at organising ourselves, I think we can, probably many of us, relate to that. Though I do think it's interesting that some of the impetus, both for the living wage campaign, where I live, and for trade unions getting involved in community work, is precisely because community workers have joined and become active in a trade union that's prepared to engage with them. I'm not saying that's the complete answer, and we have to organise ourselves anyway, I think separately as well as within other organisations. Maybe we're a bit like academics, you know, herding cats and all of that. We're all too individual, you know, we like to think of ourselves as collective people, but, you know, maybe we need to think about that a little bit more. I think the very interesting question about political parties and building alliances, we've kind of shied away from it, haven't we, in many cases. I think because of the whole history of being in and against the state and not becoming caught up in political parties' agendas, to the point when we're not actually recognising that political parties are the reality and that they're on the ground. Where I live, the ward party has, 200, 300, more than that, relatively active members, and that we've been involved in campaigning. We actually tried to campaign for the living wage at the Arsenal Stadium, not entirely successfully, it has to be. This was before a game. It wasn't a very good moment to do that. But political parties are key. They can do an awful lot. I mean, just very simple things like making space available in the town hall for the anti-austerity movement, for the private tenants to get themselves together and organise and have a dialogue. What's been important, I think, around the anti-austerity campaign is that there has been actually a very positive dialogue with the local authority. It's quite clear that if the campaign needs to criticise, they will. And there has to be that reckoning. Some of us are members of both, but on occasion we will speak up, and people have to accept that. Some accept it, some do not. But that's part of the reality, I think. That I don't know if that resonates with your neck of the wood, whichever the political party is. And I do think that in the book that May and I have been working on, there are some very interesting examples of where changes in political parties have actually been very important because they've opened spaces. And that was certainly the case when I worked for the GLC. It opened spaces for a whole lot of community work to happen. Not all of it brilliant, but it opened spaces. The final point about how have we lost our way, I don't know, maybe we spend some time in the next few days thinking about what we need to do to find it again, though I don't think everybody's lost their way, and I think that there are lots of young people, including many of the students I've worked with, who are actually very clear. They read Danny Dorling's books and they're very clear about what the nature of the issues are and how they want their practice to actually contribute, including those students who've gone on to work in some of these organisations I was mentioning. So I'm not saying there isn't a problem. Of course there's a problem. There's always a problem. And part of the problem is that the world has been changing very fast. And the ways in which we've been thinking about it we need to strike that balance between understanding the changes and not losing sight of the overall objectives in the process of understanding the changes. And I don't think there's any easy answer to that. I think it's a long-term process that we all have to engage in. But I'm sorry not to give a better answer on that. Probably at that point, should we stop, Jo?